Welcome to another session of the Indigo Firmament. We are with you again, and this time we want to discuss a different subject which is prominently displayed, shown and talked about in the log of the current events, especially since at the 15th of July, the attempted military coup in Turkey. And the subject matter has to do with the concept of governance in Islam and the label of Islamic State, Islamic government, Islamic party, and so on and so forth. And also the claims as to whether there is a case for a caliphate state. Most of these terminologies are thrown about either irresponsibly or deliberately in a way to misconstrue certain concepts that are valid in the analog of political science, but have become tools for bashing one or another culture, one or another society, and so on. So I would like to share with you the draft of an essay that I've written, and we will go step by step through the various items discussed in this. The essay is titled "How Islamic is an Islamic State?" with a question mark, obviously. A theoretical debate on political order in Muslim societies. And the synopsis reads as follows. When peaceful demands for democratic regime change from within a state, such as those in the Arab Spring, were thwarted with Western complicity, the backlash of political frustrations inevitably led to armed struggles, such as the recently declared Islamic State of Iraq and Sham, or ISIS, and their claim to establish a caliphate does not seem like a well-planned blueprint for a political state. rather a rejection of things Western, Western democracy, Western institutions, and Western imposed boundaries, such as those imposed by the 1916 Sykes-Picot Treaty that secretly planned to carve up the Muslim world into manageably small artificial states. This debate assesses whether such an Islamic state theoretically constitutes a caliphate and whether a correctly defined caliphate is relevant to modern political realities, regardless of how it is labeled and the sentimental attachment of many Muslims to the concept. So my argument here is that there are labels thrown about for political manipulation, for or against, but that if we were to define an Islamic state in a theoretical setting, we need to go deeper through a set of analysis and to see how valid the claim is, how relevant it is in historical context, and how can we authorize it, or if it has an authoritative edge in terms of the Islamic political thought. Islamist political activism suffers from a theoretical disconnect with the political reality that pursues two divergent paths: regression to a largely irrelevant political past, or digression from historical models the reformist claims to champion. We delineate the inconsistency of the two as follows. The first one is that when they talk about Islamic State, somehow there's an underlying assumption that there is no Islam today, and therefore there's no Islamic state today. So if there is one, it has to be one of the time of the Prophet. And this is the element of the regression in it, is that they want to take us back to the time of the Prophet, 14 centuries back, in order to establish an Islamic state, which is ridiculous in the sense that you would have to deny the adherence to Islamic faith principles of 1.6 billion people. The other problem with it is that if Islam is understood to be the last religion in the monotheistic traditions at least, then if this is the last one and there isn't another one coming, then this Islam, whether we define it politically or theosophically or religiously, then it cannot be a religion, a faith, and a system, political or otherwise, to be suited only for the 7th century. That it cannot be stuck in time if it is for all times. And that's the contradiction within this argument, is that on the one hand, you believe this is the last religion, which implies that it had to be timeless, not bound to a particular period in history. On the other hand, you act as though it was to be only conceived and perceived and understood and employed and applied in the 7th century mindset, in the 7th century history, in the 7th century geographic reality. The second alternative is the digression from the historical models the reformist claim to champion, which is that when there are others who claim to have a valid reason to establish a modern Islamic state in modern times, then they model it after a time in history which the very fact of, say, 14th century difference defies that reality. If there was an Islamic state at the time of the Prophet in Medina in the 7th century, which I don't believe was such, and I will get to that in a little bit, that if that was an Islamic state, how is it possible for us in modern times to manage the affairs of states, and I'm talking about nation states or those named so, in other words, to contrast them with a city-state. Medina was a city-state of the 7th century, and you want to model a 20th century society, political society, in which, for instance, take the case of Turkey, that just one city as Istanbul has a population that is 40 times or more that of the population of Medina. Forget about the country of Turkey, the state of Turkey, the Republic of Turkey. The size difference alone are very, very stark. It's not just the quantifiable, the qualifiable differences are equally stark. And so therefore you make a claim to something that's not relevant to our time, not relevant to our conditions, not relevant to our circumstance, and perhaps in many ways not sufficient in complexity to the way of life at the international arena that we live in. Now, this doesn't make our modern states un-Islamic, nor does it make the state of Medina out of some sort of a necessity an Islamic state. But if we dig deeper historically, one of the reasons that I would contradict that very first notion that Medina was not an Islamic state is that it was more of an Islamic republic, or the Medina Republic, to state it more accurately. So the Medina Republic was a pluralistic city-state with various religious communities, since religion did matter and matter more than it does now, came together and established a city-state under a constitution called Misaq al-Medina, or the Constitution of Medina, which was signed by all the contracting parties, contracting in the context of their political reality, that they signed a contract, an agreement for the security and safety and the division of responsibility as citizens of that city. And therefore, Medina was not a city as is commonly believed, but a city-state or a republic whose various communities followed their own religious norms in matters of civil and family law, for instance, but in intercommunal matters, such as the defense of the city or any external affairs that affected all the residents, they were equally responsible before the city-state. Now, if Medina was a pluralistic society, if in Medina's Muslims followed the Quran, and the Jews followed the Torah, and the Christians followed the Bible, and other communities followed their own religious traditions, whatever scripts they may have had. Therefore, we cannot put the label Islamic on it, because that would be denying the other community. And the Prophet didn't deny that. When the Prophet was signing agreements with the various tribes who were adherents of different faiths, it was in recognition of their faith, not in rejection. It was in the acceptance of that diversity of the various community, not any required assimilation, that they all must become Muslims in order to become part of the Muslim state. And therefore, historically, there is no evidence. And again, to base that on a more often or frequently referred to principle is that if there is such a thing, there has to be the sunnah or the tradition of the Prophet. So there is no tradition of the Prophet of establishing an Islamic state. He did not establish an Islamic state. And Muslims believe that the Prophet personified and epitomized a perfect person, human. And in that perfection, insofar as his political life is concerned, he, as the head of state, would have perfected that necessity if it were required. But he didn't. And the name of the city was Yathrib. It was changed to Medina to instill this concept that the government is not hereditary anymore, that its geographic location with a certain name was secondary, that the rulership had to be done on the basis of some sort of an election process, and therefore that became, if we can use a more modern terminology, it became a republic, in a pluralistic republic at that, and even more pluralistic than our modern societies, because they practice not only religious pluralism, which in terms of or in respect to legal matters, each religious community adhered to their own scriptures, whereas in modern times we don't do that. We establish a constitution based on certain principles, Judeo-Christians, manifest destiny, or other concepts of modern political thought. And therefore, we may have political pluralism, allowing different political parties and groups to operate within the state, but we do not practice religious pluralism. That which we follow in the legal sense is, for lack of a better term, the law of the land. So in this case, the Medina Republic was more pluralistic, therefore more democratic, because they were not imposing the law of the land on all, except on matters, on civil matters. Defense of the city was a matter that pertained to every citizen of that small political entity. So it didn't matter whether you were a Muslim or a Christian or a Jew or a pagan or whatever other religion you may have had. You were equally responsible for defending the city. There you had the equality. But say in terms of divorce, inheritance, matters of worship, and so on, there was no such a thing as the law of the land. Rather, the adherents were obedient only to their own scripture, and nobody else's scripture was imposed on them. So, if we explore the concept and say that the Medina Republic was an Islamic state, then the Islamic rules would have been the only rules that mattered, which wasn't the case. Now, the Quran too addresses this shift in societal needs as the vocative "O believers" in the Meccan revelations is replaced with more broadly inclusive "O people" in the revelation of the Medina city-state. Perhaps for this very reason, the term Ummah at the time of the Prophet referred to the community of citizens of all faiths and not necessarily the Muslim community as it is commonly perceived nowadays. Thus, in accommodating both political as well as religious pluralism, the Medina model was more advanced, at least in theory, than modern society. So therefore, if we don't have a tradition of the Prophet to claim Medina to be an Islamic state, which is secondary in rank to the Quran, we don't even have anything in the Quran. And the Quran, in terms of the chronology of revelations, each surah or chapter is identified with that particular term, whether it's a Meccan revelation or a Medinan revelation. And that's critical because in Mecca, the individual was addressed. A faith community was addressed. Whereas in Medina, there were times when all the citizens were addressed. And the term would be changed from "O believers" to "O people." Now that is not necessarily through and through. And I mean, the distinction is not so clearly distinguishable. Rather, the distinction is depends on whether the matter was relevant to the life of that particular faith community, which would have been Muslims, or to the people of the city, which would have been Muslims as well as non-Muslims. And therefore, in the early Islamic history, the term Ummah would simply refer to citizenry of a state. So Ummah included the Jews and the Christians and Sabine and peoples of other faith. That we subsequently in history, and unfortunately, used that exclusively for Muslim citizens of a state is actually taking back the reformist principles to which the Prophet adhered, because his whole emphasis was that the human race ought to have reached a state in which hereditary power should be ended and people should have the right to practice their faith as they believe in and to adhere to a state as they live in. And that distinction made Medina a model city of its time, a model city-state of its time. In fact, the theoretical concept of Plato, the Republic, in which a philosopher king was to rule, was augmented and enhanced further by Al-Farabi, the great Muslim philosopher, to, in a way, explain the Medina model in which the philosopher king got a third dimension: the philosopher, the prophet, and the king. In other words, the rulership of the state, the thought process of the philosopher, and the administrative skills of a king were necessary to run a state like Medina. And in fact, Al-Farabi's treatise that echoes Plato's thought is called Al-Madinatu Fazila. That would be the elevated, the advanced, or the ideal republic. We could go to a third argument in this regard, and that's throughout history, Muslim theologians took pride in the independence of their thought, resisting to be co-opted into the government, and thus prevented the formation of a theocracy. Now, the politics of the ulama were separate from the politics of the government. And from a Western perspective, where generally things are viewed as the either or, that is, in the West, when we have theocracies, as a state where the religion and the church were one and the same, they had to rule only as a church, in a sense. That's what made it theocracy. And when theocracies fell out of favor and fell out of power, the secular states that came into existence, then the role of religion and the theologians became totally irrelevant. In other words, we in the West have lived either under state with no church, or with church and no state. Whereas the Muslim society in general was able to balance the two. So the argument was not based on either or, one or the other, but rather both and. That in Islamic society, the rulers were in charge of the political affairs, regardless of their title, whether they call themselves kings or emperors or sultans or khalifas. Their domain and their authority was a political authority, and it had its own place. But the ulama were operating independent of the state, and therefore it allowed for a continuity. That is, with the collapse of a particular empire or caliphate, the whole thing didn't fall apart, because the non-state entities were still operational. And that is the important reason that we can then go to this second argument, or the third or fourth, is that Muslim societies did not develop theocracies because the ulama resisted any temptation by the state, by the emperor, by the sultan, to be co-opted into it. And one of the reasons would have been, again, the religious pluralism of the society at large. Again, the common belief is that when we say Muslim societies like the Abbasids, the assumption is made that everyone must have been a Muslim. Not so. Muslim heads of states ruled over societies in which Muslims were often minorities. Let me repeat that one more time. For a long time, the societies that we presume to have been all Muslim societies were not so. Non-Muslim minorities existed all along the history, while those states may out of some necessity have been called Islamic. And to this day, if not to the 20th, but at least 21st, but at least until the 20th century, in almost every Muslim society, there were enough minorities of different religions that would have been the majority at one point, and slowly with the passing of time, the Muslims have become a majority, not spontaneously, not instantaneously, not through any kind of forced conversion that took place in Europe, not through the decrees of the ruler who may have woken up one day with a particular dream and the next day everybody changed their religion. Not so in the Muslim societies. So let's take a short break and we'll be back with you after this.